A waitress slips a Billionaire a note that says, "Don't eat it. Leave now." And instead of listening, he takes one more bite. But the moment he does, his entire world explodes into chaos because something keeps killing him over and over again. And every morning, he wakes up right back at the same diner, staring at the same warning in her shaking hands. He thinks she's messing with him until one day she looks him in the eyes and says, "We've lived this day more times than you can count." Suddenly, the Billionaire discovers this isn't just a warning. It's a clue to a disaster he hasn't even caused yet. Time is breaking. Reality is glitching. And the only person who can help him is the woman trying to save his life before it's too late. But if he's the one who started the time loop in the future, what terrifying truth is he trying to stop? And will he figure it out before the next reset becomes the last one? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of David Hale's penthouse bedroom, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. As consciousness slowly crept in, David's eyes fluttered open precisely at 7 o'clock, just as they did every morning. But today something felt different. An unsettling sensation nagged at the edges of his mind, like a word sitting on the tip of his tongue. He sat up in his king-sized bed, running a hand through his dark hair as he tried to shake off the strange feeling. The silk sheets whispered against his skin as he moved, a familiar comfort that somehow felt hollow this morning. Everything in the room was exactly where it should be. The carefully curated artwork on the walls, the precisely arranged items on his bedside table, even the way the morning light hit the chrome fixtures. Yet something felt off-kilter, like looking at a photograph that had been ever so slightly tilted. "Pull it together," he muttered to himself, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The plush carpet cushioned his feet as he walked to his walk-in closet, selecting his usual attire, a perfectly tailored charcoal grey suit, crisp white shirt, and deep blue tie. Each movement was practiced, efficient, the product of years of routine. As he knotted his tie in front of the mirror, David caught his own reflection. Successful, put together, every inch the billionaire tech mogul the world expected him to be. But his eyes held a hint of uncertainty that he couldn't quite mask. The déjà vu sensation grew stronger, making his normally steady hands hesitate for just a moment. At exactly 7:45, David stepped into the private elevator that would take him to the lobby. His driver, Marcus, was waiting with the sleek black town car, just as he always did. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Marcus said, opening the rear door with a practiced motion. "Morning, Marcus," David replied, sliding into the butter-soft leather seat. The car pulled smoothly into the morning traffic, following the same route it had taken countless times before. David watched the city scroll past his window, trying to focus on the day ahead, meetings, calls, decisions worth millions. But that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him alone. At 8:14, right on schedule, the car pulled up in front of Carter's Diner. It wasn't the kind of establishment someone of his wealth and status would typically frequent. Just a modest neighborhood spot with slightly worn vinyl booths and chrome-edged tables. But something about its unpretentious authenticity had drawn him in months ago, and now it was part of his morning routine. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the familiar scent of coffee and breakfast foods wrapping around him like a comfortable blanket. A few regular customers looked up briefly before returning to their meals. David made his way to booth 3, his usual spot, where he could observe the entire diner while maintaining a measure of privacy. Natalie Carter approached his table with the same gentle grace she always showed, coffee pot in hand. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was something striking about her, a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, wisdom in her dark eyes that seemed beyond her years. Her crisp white uniform and navy blue apron were spotless, her curly hair neatly pulled back. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice warm but professional as she poured his coffee. The rich aroma rose between them, but something in her manner seemed different today. There was a tension in her shoulders, a slight tremor in her hand that he'd never noticed before. Before he could respond, she set down a folded piece of paper alongside his coffee cup. Her eyes met his for just a moment, and in them he saw something that made his breath catch. Fear. Concern. Then she was moving away, leaving him staring at the mysterious note. David's fingers hesitated over the folded paper. This wasn't part of their routine. In all the months he'd been coming here, their interactions had never deviated from the pleasant but professional script of customer and server. With that persistent déjà vu still clouding his thoughts, he unfolded the note. The message was simple, written in hurried but neat handwriting. "Don't eat it. Leave now." David frowned, looking up to find Natalie, but she was busy with other customers, deliberately not meeting his gaze. The note made no sense. He hadn't even ordered yet, though he always got the same thing, the breakfast special with eggs over easy, wheat toast, and crispy hash browns. "Ridiculous," he muttered, tucking the note into his suit pocket. He was a man of logic, of rational decisions based on data and facts. Anonymous warnings had no place in his carefully ordered world. When Natalie returned, he ordered his usual breakfast, ignoring the flash of dismay that crossed her face. The food arrived promptly, steam rising from the perfectly cooked eggs. David picked up his fork, still thinking about the strange note and Natalie's odd behavior. The first bite was exactly as he expected. The kitchen at Carter's never disappointed. That's when he heard it, a creaking sound from above, followed by a metallic snap. David looked up just in time to see the ancient ceiling fan breaking free from its mount. Time seemed to slow as the heavy fixture plummeted toward him, its blades spinning lazily through the air. Pain exploded through his body as the fan crashed down. He heard screams, felt warm liquid that might have been blood or coffee or both. The world began to fade, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. His last conscious thought was of Natalie's warning, and how he should have listened. Then, with a gasp, David's eyes flew open. He was in his bed, morning sun streaming through the windows. His heart pounded as he sat up, hands frantically checking his body for injuries that should have been there. But there was nothing. No pain, no blood, no evidence of what had just happened. The clock on his bedside table read 7 o'clock exactly. David's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The memory of the ceiling fan, the crash, the pain, it all felt completely real. But here he was, alive and unharmed in his bedroom, at the start of what should have been a new day. "What is happening to me?" he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and confusion. The words seemed to hang in the air of his perfectly ordered bedroom, challenging everything he thought he knew about reality and time itself. The familiar déjà vu sensation washed over him again, stronger now, and with it came the terrifying realization that this morning, this exact morning, might not be as new as it should be. David sat there in his expensive sheets, in his luxury penthouse, feeling for the first time in his carefully controlled life that he had absolutely no idea what was going on. David stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his hands still trembling as he straightened his tie. The memory of the ceiling fan crash felt impossibly real, yet here he was, completely unharmed. He needed to understand what was happening, and there was only one way to do that. Follow his routine exactly and document every detail. He grabbed his phone and started taking notes. 7:15, elevator down to lobby. 7:20, George, his regular driver, waiting with the town car. 7:25, passing Central Park, just as the morning joggers were out in force. Every moment matched his memory perfectly. "This is insane," he muttered, watching the familiar streets pass by. George glanced at him in the rearview mirror but said nothing. The car pulled up to Carter's Diner at exactly 8:14, just like yesterday. Or was it still today? The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Same customers at the counter, same music playing softly from the kitchen radio, same scent of coffee and bacon in the air. David slid into booth 3, his heart racing as he waited. Right on cue, Natalie approached with the coffee pot. Her warm smile was identical to the one he remembered, but now he studied her more carefully. There was something in her eyes, a shadow of concern that seemed genuine, not the look of someone playing an elaborate joke. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said, pouring his coffee. And there it was. The note, slipped onto the table with the same subtle movement he remembered. David's fingers shook as he unfolded it. "Don't eat it. Leave now." He watched Natalie as she moved to other tables, noting how naturally she interacted with other customers. If this was a prank, she was an exceptional actress. But her earlier tension was visible in the way she kept glancing back at his booth, genuine worry creasing her brow. When she returned for his order, David cleared his throat. "Just toast today, please. Whole wheat." Relief flickered across her face, but she simply nodded and wrote down his order. The toast arrived quickly, perfectly browned and buttered. David ate slowly, hyper-aware of the ceiling fan spinning harmlessly above him. Maybe he had imagined everything. Maybe. The screech of tires outside shattered his thoughts. David turned toward the sound just as a massive delivery truck careened toward the diner's front window. Time seemed to slow as the glass exploded inward, the truck's grille filling his vision. There was a moment of searing pain, then darkness. 7 o'clock. David's scream echoed through his bedroom as he jolted awake, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. 2 deaths, 2 resets. This couldn't be happening. "I have to break the pattern," he said aloud, running his hands through his hair. "Change everything." This time, he left his apartment at 7:30, taking a different elevator down. Instead of George's town car, he hailed a taxi. He arrived at Carter's at 8:25, choosing a counter seat instead of his usual booth. When Natalie approached with coffee, he quickly said, "Green tea, please." She blinked in surprise, but brought his tea. There was no note this time, but he caught her watching him with the same worried expression. David sipped his tea, carefully scanning the diner for potential threats. No loose ceiling fans, no trucks outside. He was just starting to relax when the man next to him began to choke. David jumped up to help, but slipped on spilled water. His head hit the counter with a crack, and darkness claimed him again. 7 o'clock. Different route, different time, different seat. This time a table by the kitchen. Death by grease fire. 7 o'clock. Skip the diner entirely, try a coffee shop across town. Piano falling from a 4th-floor apartment. During delivery. 7 o'clock. Stay home. Gas leak explosion. 7 o'clock. Take the subway instead of driving. Platform collapse. With each death and reset, David's desperation grew. The only constant was Natalie, her worried glances, her mysterious warning note when he sat in booth 3, her apparent understanding that something was terribly wrong. She knew something. She had to know something. Lying in his bed after his latest death, electrocution by malfunctioning coffee maker, David stared at the ceiling as 7 o'clock ticked by once again. The answer wasn't in avoiding death. He'd proven that dozens of times now. The answer was in the diner, in Natalie Carter and her cryptic warning. "No more running," he whispered, pushing himself up. "Tomorrow, or today, whatever this is, I'm getting answers." He would go to the diner at the usual time, sit in booth 3, and confront Natalie directly. She was the key to understanding this nightmare, and he was done playing this deadly game of chance. As he prepared for yet another iteration of this endless morning, David felt something he hadn't experienced in all his previous loops. Purpose. Whatever force had trapped him in this time loop, whatever connection Natalie had to it all, he would find out the truth. He had died enough times to lose his fear of death. Now he just wanted answers. David's alarm blared at 7 o'clock in the morning, but he was already awake. He had spent the last several loops planning this moment, rehearsing what he would say. His usual pristine morning routine was abandoned as he threw on yesterday's suit and rushed to his car, bypassing his driver, George, entirely. The streets of downtown were quiet at this early hour, most businesses still dark behind locked doors. Carter's Diner stood silent, its windows reflecting the pink-orange glow of sunrise. David parked his Mercedes in the empty lot and checked his watch. 6:45. According to the schedule posted on the door, the diner opened at 7, but staff arrived earlier to prep. He walked around to the back of the building, where a few employee cars were already parked. The kitchen lights were on, and through the windows he could see the cook moving around, getting ready for the morning rush. David's hands were sweating as he waited, hiding partly behind the dumpster where he could watch the back door. At 7:10, a small blue Honda pulled into the lot. David's breath caught as he recognized Natalie stepping out, her waitress uniform already on under her coat. She walked toward the back door, fishing keys from her purse. "Natalie," he called out, stepping into view. "We need to talk." She spun around, startled. Her purse dropped, spilling its contents across the pavement. But when she saw his face, something changed in her expression. Not fear, recognition. Deep, profound recognition that made his skin prickle. "You finally came early," she said softly, making no move to pick up her scattered belongings. David took a step closer. "What do you mean, finally? What do you know about what's happening to me?" Natalie glanced at the back door, then at her watch. "Come inside. Booth 3. No more notes, no more cryptic warnings." David insisted. "I've died dozens of times now. I need answers." "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know about all of them. Please, just booth 3. It's important." Something in her tone made David follow without further argument. They entered through the back, Natalie nodding to the cook as they passed through the kitchen. The dining room was empty, chairs still up on tables from the night before. David sat in booth 3 while Natalie went behind the counter. She poured 2 cups of coffee with trembling hands, then slid into the seat across from him. For a long moment, she just stared into her cup. "You remember the loops too," David said. It wasn't a question. Natalie nodded. "I've been aware of them longer than you have. Weeks before you started noticing." She took a shaky breath. "The first time I thought I was going crazy. Then I realized I was the only one who remembered when the day reset. Until you." "How do you know about my deaths?" "Because I've seen them all." Natalie's eyes filled with tears. "I've watched you die so many times, tried to warn you in so many ways. The ceiling fan, you said, 'This isn't possible' right before it hit you." David felt the blood drain from his face. He had never told anyone those words. "The truck crash," she continued. "You looked right at me as it came through the window. The choking incident at the counter. You whispered, 'Not again,' when you fell. The piano." Her voice cracked. "I've been trying to save you, but I never knew when you'd finally remember the loops too. When you'd believe me." "The note," David said, his mind racing. "You've been leaving me the same warning every time I sit here." "Different warnings, actually. I tried everything I could think of. Some loops I tried to be more specific about the danger. Sometimes I tried to convince you to leave town entirely. Once I even wrote out a long explanation about the time loop, but you thought it was a joke." She gave a sad smile. "The simple warning worked best. At least it got you to notice something was wrong." David ran his hands over his face, overwhelmed by the revelation that he hadn't been alone in this nightmare. All this time, Natalie had been watching, remembering, trying to help him. "But why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why us?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Natalie's hands tightened around her coffee cup as she met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw the same confusion and fear that had been haunting him through every loop. They sat in charged silence, the hum of the diner's refrigerators and the distant clatter of the cook's preparations creating a mundane backdrop to their impossible conversation. Everyday life continued around them, oblivious to the fact that two people trapped in an endless temporal loop were trying to understand their connection to each other and the forces that had ensnared them. The first customers would be arriving soon, bringing with them another chance for disaster, another potential reset. But for the first time since this nightmare began, David felt something like hope. He wasn't alone anymore. Whatever this was, whatever force had chosen them, at least now they could face it together. "We need to leave. Now!" Natalie stood abruptly, her coffee untouched. "It's not safe here. Never is around this time." David glanced at the empty diner. "Where can we go?" "My grandmother's house," Natalie said, already untying her apron. "She'll understand. She always does." She called toward the kitchen. "Tommy, family emergency. Cover for me?" The cook's concerned face appeared in the service window. "Everything okay, Natalie?" "It will be." She gave him a reassuring smile that David could tell she'd practiced through countless loops. "Just need the morning off." Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Natalie led them to a car, a well-maintained but aging sedan. "Follow me in your car," she instructed. "It's about 15 minutes from here." The drive took them away from the busy downtown area, through quiet residential streets where children waited for school buses and early morning joggers waved to neighbors. They turned onto a tree-lined road that led to the outskirts of town, where houses sat farther apart and gardens grew bigger. Natalie pulled into the driveway of a modest single-story home with weathered blue shutters and a wraparound porch filled with potted plants. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the morning breeze. David parked behind her, noting how the simple beauty of the place made his penthouse feel cold and sterile in comparison. Before they reached the front door, it opened to reveal Mary Carter. She was shorter than her granddaughter, but carried herself with the same quiet dignity. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes held a warmth that made David think of summer afternoons. "I was wondering when you'd bring him by," Mary said, surprising them both. She stepped aside, gesturing them in. "Come on now, I've got tea brewing." David shot Natalie a questioning look, but she seemed just as confused by her grandmother's reaction. They followed Mary through a cozy living room filled with family photos and well-loved furniture to a sunny kitchen where a teapot steamed on the counter. "Mrs. Carter," David began, "I'm not sure how much Natalie has told you about the time loops?" Mary finished, setting out 3 mismatched teacups. "About how you keep dying and waking up at 7 o'clock every morning. About how my granddaughter has been carrying this burden alone until now." She poured the tea with steady hands. "Sit down, both of you. Some things are better, discussed over a proper cup of tea." They settled around the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through lace curtains and casting delicate patterns on the worn tablecloth. Mary added honey to her tea with deliberate movements before speaking again. "What you're experiencing," she said, is what my grandmother used to call a spiritual echo. It's when time bends because someone, or in this case, two someones, need to be redirected toward their proper purpose. You believe us? David asked, amazed at her calm acceptance. Mary's eyes crinkled with understanding. Child, I've seen enough in my life to know that God's ways aren't always straight lines. Sometimes they're circles, leading us back around until we learn what we need to learn. The tension David had been carrying for countless loops began to ease. Here in this warm kitchen, with the scent of chamomile tea and fresh baked bread in the air, the impossible felt manageable. But why is it happening? Natalie asked, wrapping her hands around her teacup. Why us? That's something you'll have to discover together, Mary replied. These echoes don't happen by accident. They're like spiritual course corrections, when someone has strayed too far from their path, or when two paths that should have crossed have missed each other. David sank back in his chair, letting the words wash over him. The feeling in this house was so different from his penthouse, so alive with memory and love. It reminded him of Sunday afternoons at his grandmother's house before she passed away, before he threw himself into building his empire and forgot what real warmth felt like. They talked through the morning and into the afternoon. Mary shared stories from her own life, moments when faith had carried her through impossible situations. She spoke of losing her husband young, of raising Natalie alone after her parents left, of finding strength in community and purpose in helping others. As evening approached, David felt something he hadn't experienced since the loops began. Hope. Maybe this wasn't a curse. Maybe, as Mary suggested, it was an opportunity for correction, for growth. I should head back, he said finally, noting the lengthening shadows. But I'll return first thing tomorrow morning. Mary hugged him before he left, a genuine maternal embrace that caught him off guard. Be careful, she whispered. The night can be treacherous. Natalie walked him to his car. This is the first time I've felt like we might actually fix this, she admitted. Me too, David replied. Your grandmother is remarkable. She always knows exactly what people need to hear. Natalie smiled. See you tomorrow? 7 a.m. sharp, he promised with a wry smile. The drive back to the city was peaceful. Streetlights flickered on as dusk settled, and David found himself thinking about Mary's words about spiritual course corrections. Had he strayed so far from his true path that the universe itself had to intervene? He pulled into his usual parking spot outside his building, his mind still full of warm tea and gentle wisdom. As he stepped out of his car, he heard an electrical buzzing overhead. He looked up just as the street light above him exploded in a shower of sparks. The last thing he felt was a searing pain, and then his eyes snapped open in his bedroom. The digital clock on his nightstand read 7 o'clock a.m. It's getting worse, he whispered into the empty room, his heart pounding with the memory of electricity and the loss of that brief, precious hope. David's eyes flew open at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning. His heart was still racing from the memory of electricity coursing through his body. Without wasting time on his usual morning routine, he threw on the first clothes he could grab and rushed to his car. The streets were eerily quiet as he sped toward Carter's diner, running through red lights with reckless abandon. What did it matter if he crashed? The loop would just reset anyway. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. When he pulled into the diner's parking lot at 7:35, nearly 40 minutes earlier than his usual arrival, Natalie was already standing by the back door. She wore her blue waitress uniform, but her name tag was missing, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, as if she too had rushed here without finishing her normal preparations. You felt it too, didn't you? She called out as he approached. The way everything shifted during that last reset? David nodded, still catching his breath. The streetlight explosion. It was different, more violent, and when I woke up, the air felt wrong somehow. We need to show you something. Natalie grabbed his arm and pulled him around the back of the diner. I've been waiting for the right moment, trying to figure out how to tell you, but after what happened yesterday at Grandma's, and now this, we're running out of time. They hurried through the early morning mist toward her car. The sky above them seemed slightly off-color, like an old photograph that had started to fade. As they drove, David noticed other small irregularities. A flock of birds that seemed to hover motionless in mid-flight, a traffic light that blinked in an impossible pattern of colors. "What's happening?" he asked, pressing his hand against the cool glass of the passenger window. "The loop is breaking down," Natalie replied, her voice tight with worry. "And it's my fault for not telling you sooner. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, that you'd think I was crazy." They pulled up to Mary's house 15 minutes later. The garden, which had seemed so peaceful yesterday, now felt charged with an unseen energy. Mary stood on the porch, wringing her hands, her usual calm demeanor cracked with concern. "Quick," she called out, "before it gets worse." Natalie led David past the house to a weather-beaten shed in the back corner of the yard. The padlock on the door looked new, out of place against the aged wood. Her hands shook slightly as she unlocked it. "3 weeks ago," she began. "Before you started remembering the loops, something happened. Someone came to the diner, someone who looked exactly like you, but older, desperate. He gave me this and made me promise to keep it safe until the right moment." Inside the shed, Natalie moved aside some garden tools and pulled up a loose floorboard. Beneath it sat a metal box, no bigger than a shoebox. When she lifted it out, David could see scorch marks along its edges. He said— Natalie paused, looking at David with a mix of fear and compassion. "He said he was you, from the future." David's stomach lurched as she opened the box. Inside lay a device about the size of a smartphone, but unlike anything he'd ever seen before. It was made of a dark metal that seemed to absorb light, with intricate circuitry visible beneath a partially transparent casing. And there, etched into its surface, was the unmistakable logo of Hale Technologies, his company. "That's impossible," he whispered, reaching for the device with trembling fingers. I wouldn't." "Your future self said you would create it," Natalie continued softly. "He said something terrible happens, something you tried to prevent by making this. But it went wrong. The temporal field became unstable." As David held the device, memories that weren't his own flickered through his mind. Late nights in a lab he hadn't built yet, equations he didn't understand yet, a desperate race against time to prevent something catastrophic. "We need to get this somewhere safe," he said, turning toward the house. But as they stepped out of the shed, the world around them suddenly stuttered like a skipping video. Cars on the distant street froze mid-motion. A flock of birds reversed direction, flying backward across the rippling sky. The air itself seemed to vibrate with wrongness. David watched in horror as a falling leaf paused, hung suspended, then slowly began to reattach itself to a nearby tree. Mary came running from the house, her face pale. "The temporal distortions are spreading," she said, her voice shaking. "I can feel it. Time itself is coming undone." "It's not just affecting the diner anymore," Natalie realized. "The loop is growing." David stared at the device in his hands, this thing he would supposedly create, this thing that had torn a hole in the fabric of time itself. The weight of it felt impossible. Not just its physical mass, but the responsibility it represented. "I did this," he said quietly. "Some version of me caused all of this." A car alarm started blaring down the street. its wail distorting and warping until it sounded like a scream. The sky above them rippled again, colors bleeding into each other like wet paint. "The loop isn't just about me anymore," David said, gripping the device tighter as another wave of temporal distortion washed over them. "If we don't fix this soon, everything, everyone, will be pulled into the chaos." The three of them stood in Mary's backyard, watching as reality flickered and warped around them, the very air seeming to crack like glass under the strain of fractured time. The device in David's hands hummed with an energy he could feel in his bones, a reminder that somewhere in his future lay the knowledge that had broken the world, and perhaps the key to saving it. The red numbers on David's bedside clock blinked 7 o'clock in the morning, and he was already moving. No more testing, no more wondering. He knew exactly where he needed to be. He threw on clothes without checking if they matched and rushed to his car, his hands steady despite the urgency thrumming through his body. The early morning streets were eerily quiet, but not in the usual peaceful way. David noticed a newspaper floating upward instead of blowing down the street. A traffic light cycled green, yellow, red in random patterns. The time distortions were getting worse, spreading beyond the diner like ink in water. He pulled up to Carter's Diner at 7:30, nearly 45 minutes earlier than his usual arrival. Natalie was already waiting by the back door, her dark eyes filled with knowing concern. She'd tied her curly hair back with a yellow bandana that somehow made her look both younger and more determined. "You felt it too?" she asked as he approached. "The changes in the air?" David nodded, following her inside. "It's like reality is coming apart at the seams. We need to secure everything we can." Mary appeared from the kitchen, carrying a box of emergency supplies, flashlights, batteries, bottled water. "The house is ready," she said. "I've been up since 5 checking the windows and doors. They keep sticking, opening and closing on their own." As if to prove her point, the diner's front door suddenly slammed shut, then immediately reopened, then slammed again. The sound echoed a full second before each movement, like sound and vision were out of sync. "We need to go," Natalie said, grabbing her grandmother's hand. "David, help me with these supplies." They loaded everything into David's car, working quickly as the morning light seemed to pulse and dim around them. The drive to Mary's house took 10 minutes, but somehow also felt like hours, time stretching and contracting like a rubber band. At the house, they found the temporal device exactly where they'd left it, though the metal box now hummed with an unsettling frequency. David lifted it carefully, studying the intricate patterns etched into its surface. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of grooves. "These markings, they're not random. They almost look like fingerprints." Natalie finished, reaching out to touch them. The moment both their hands made contact with the device, it gave off a soft blue glow. "It's keyed to us both. That's why we're the only ones who remember the loops." They spent the next hour securing Mary's house. Doors kept shifting in their frames, requiring extra locks and braces. The lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost meaningful, like some kind of code they couldn't quite crack. Mary's voice sometimes emerged seconds before she opened her mouth to speak, creating an eerie echo effect that made conversation difficult. "We need to understand the pattern," David said, spreading out papers on Mary's kitchen table. "Every loop, every death, every minor detail might matter." Natalie nodded, pulling out a small notebook she'd been keeping. "I've been tracking your routine for weeks. The way you sit in booth 3, always ordering the same breakfast special. How you tap your spoon twice against your coffee cup before drinking." "Wait." David paused, looking at her with new appreciation. "You noticed all that?" A slight blush colored Natalie's cheeks. "I notice everything about you," she said softly, then quickly added, "About all my regular customers, I mean." They spent hours reconstructing every loop in detail. The ceiling fan death, the delivery truck, the streetlight explosion. Each incident had seemed random, but as they mapped them out, patterns began to emerge. Outside, the temporal distortions grew more pronounced. They watched through the window as Mr. Peterson, the neighborhood mailman, walked past the house 3 times in succession, giving the exact same wave and calling out, "Beautiful morning," each time. A golden retriever ran in perfect circles on the lawn across the street, caught in its own private time loop. "The clocks," Mary called from the living room. "Look at the clocks." Every timepiece in the house was moving independently, the microwave displayed numbers counting backward. The old grandfather clock's hands spun wildly in opposite directions. Even David's expensive watch had gone haywire, the second hand jumping erratically. Despite the chaos around them, David found himself drawn into conversation with Natalie as they worked. She told him about growing up in the house, raised by Mary after her parents left. He shared stories about building his company from nothing, the loneliness of success, the emptiness of his penthouse view. "Sometimes I think that's why I started coming to the diner," he admitted, helping her reorganize the emergency supplies as another temporal wave made the house creak. It felt real, warm, like somewhere I could just exist without having to be anybody important. Natalie's hand brushed his as she reached for a flashlight. "You were always somebody important," she said quietly. "Even before I knew your name." The afternoon light began to fade, though the sun seemed to set in stuttering movements like frames missing from a film. They were both exhausted, but something had shifted between them. Every accidental touch lingered a moment longer. Every shared glance held more meaning. Mary brought them soup for dinner, though the spoons kept disappearing and reappearing in their hands. "Whatever happens," she said, her voice strong despite the fear in her eyes, "you two were brought together for a reason. Hold on to that." As night fell, the sky above Mary's house began to tear. It started as a thin line of darkness, like a crack in glass, but quickly spread into a gaping void. David stood at the window, watching in horror as the tear grew larger, reality itself splitting apart. "Natalie," he called out, reaching for her hand. She grabbed it just as the void descended, and the last thing he felt was her fingers intertwined with his before darkness swallowed him whole. At 7 o'clock in the morning, David's eyes snapped open. His hand still tingled where Natalie had held it, though that moment was now technically tomorrow's yesterday. He sat up, shaken but filled with new purpose. They were closer to understanding, closer to fixing this. And somehow, impossibly, he wasn't alone anymore. The sun hadn't yet risen when David pulled up to Mary's house. The dark blue of early morning still clung to the sky, broken only by the first pink hints of dawn. His headlights caught Natalie standing on the porch, already waiting. She wore a simple blue sweater and jeans, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail, but something about seeing her made his heart skip. The porch steps creaked as he approached. Behind Natalie, the screen door opened, and Mary emerged wrapped in her faded floral robe. Her eyes held that mix of wisdom and worry that seemed to define her lately. "Come in for a moment," Mary said softly. "Both of you." Inside, the house felt different in the pre-dawn stillness. The temporal distortions were subtle now, just the occasional flicker of a shadow where it shouldn't be, the soft echo of footsteps that hadn't happened yet. Mary led them to her small kitchen, where 3 cups of steaming tea waited on the table. "How did you know we'd both come early?" David asked, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Mary's smile was gentle. "Some things you just know in your heart." She reached out, taking one of their hands in each of hers. "Before you go, I need to pray over you both." David wasn't religious, hadn't been since he was small, but something in Mary's quiet certainty made him bow his head alongside Natalie. Mary's voice was barely above a whisper. "Lord, watch over these two souls as they face what's coming. Sometimes faith is the only thread holding time together, and right now they need that thread to be strong. Guide their steps, light their path, and bring them safely home." When David opened his eyes, he found them surprisingly damp. Natalie squeezed his hand under the table, and he realized they'd reached for each other without thinking. "The device," Natalie said, pulling the scorched metal box from her bag. "We should go somewhere quiet to examine it." David nodded. "I know just the place." They drove out past the edge of town in David's car, the rising sun painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The temporal distortions were less frequent here, away from populated areas. David turned onto a dirt road that led to an open field, tall grass swaying in the morning breeze. "I used to come here sometimes," he explained as they got out. "When the city felt too crowded, the electromagnetic interference is minimal. Might help with whatever this thing is." They found a relatively flat spot and sat cross-legged in the grass, the device between them. Up close, the Hail Tech logo was unmistakable, though scarred by what looked like burn marks. David's fingers traced the familiar curves of his company's emblem. "How do we activate it?" Natalie asked. "I built it, or will build it." David corrected himself. "There must be something." His fingers found a small depression, barely visible. When he pressed it, nothing happened. "Try again," Natalie encouraged. "Maybe it needs both of us, like everything else in this loop." She placed her hand next to his, their fingers brushing. David pressed the depression again, and this time a soft hum filled the air. Light erupted from the device, coalescing into a flickering human shape. David gasped. The hologram showed him, but older, maybe 10 years older. His future self's hair was streaked with grey, his face lined with exhaustion and something darker. Regret, David realized. Pure, crushing regret. The hologram spoke, its voice distorted but recognizable as his own. "If you're seeing this, you didn't listen the first time." Future David ran a hand through his grey, streaked hair. "God, I hoped you would. But you're stubborn, we're stubborn, and now everything's falling apart." Natalie shifted closer to David as they watched. The hologram continued. "There's an experiment scheduled at Hail Tech. The board is pushing for it, calling it revolutionary. And it is. But not in the way they think. It goes wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Millions die." The hologram flickered, and future David's voice grew more urgent. "I tried everything to stop it. Warnings, sabotage, even direct confrontation. Nothing worked. So I built this. A temporal manipulation device. Created a loop to buy us time to fix it." He paused, looking directly at where Natalie sat. "Natalie, I'm sorry for dragging you into this, but you're the only person I trusted enough to help. The only one who ever saw past the money and the power to who I really was, who I could be." The message cut off abruptly as a wave of temporal distortion rushed across the field. The grass rippled like water, moving backward and forward in time simultaneously. The sky above them seemed to fold in on itself. "Run!" David grabbed Natalie's hand, snatching up the device with his other hand. They sprinted towards the car as reality warped around them. Trees aged and rejuvenated in seconds. Flowers bloomed and died in eye blinks. They made it to the car just as the wave passed, leaving everything unnaturally still in its wake. Both of them were breathing, hard, more from fear than exertion. David started the engine with shaking hands, and they headed back toward town. Natalie was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the too still landscape. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "Why me?" she whispered. "What is it about me that made your future self trust me so much?" She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for answers he didn't have yet. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, wishing he understood. The hologram's words echoed in his mind. The only one who ever saw past the money and the power to who I really was, who I could be. The next morning at 7 o'clock, David woke with renewed purpose. He dressed in his sharpest suit, knowing they needed to look completely professional for what came next. When he picked up Natalie at Mary's house, she was wearing a borrowed business outfit, a simple black skirt and blazer that made her look every bit the corporate assistant. "Ready?" he asked as she slid into the passenger seat. "As I'll ever be." She smoothed her skirt nervously. "Just remember, we need to stay together. The loops are getting worse when we're apart." The drive to Hale Tech's gleaming headquarters took 20 minutes. The massive glass building stretched towards the sky, its windows reflecting the morning sun. David noticed how the reflection seemed to waver unnaturally, another sign of time's increasing instability. At the security desk, David signed them both in. "Ms. Carter will be assisting me today," he said with the casual authority that came from owning the company. The guard barely glanced at them, though his movements seemed to stutter slightly, a micro-glitch in time. They took the elevator to the 42nd floor, where the most sensitive research was conducted. As they walked down the pristine white hallway, Natalie gasped. David saw it too. The corridor suddenly duplicated itself, creating an impossible mirror image that lasted for 3 seconds before snapping back to normal. "It's getting worse," Natalie whispered. They reached the secure archives, where David used his biometric credentials to gain access. Inside, rows of servers hummed with data, and holographic displays showed ongoing experiments throughout the building. Without warning, all the alarms in the section began blaring at once, though nothing was wrong. The sound cut off as abruptly as it started. "Look." Natalie pointed to a group of 3 scientists in the adjacent lab. Through the glass wall, they could see the researchers having what appeared to be a normal conversation. But then it repeated. Exactly the same gestures, exactly the same words, all 3 moving in perfect synchronization like a video on loop. "Time's breaking down," David muttered, turning to the main terminal. His fingers flew over the keyboard, accessing restricted files. There has to be something here about the experiment Future Me warned us about. After 20 minutes of searching, he found it. "Project Kronos," he read aloud. "A temporal energy generator designed to harness quantum fluctuations in space-time." He scrolled through pages of technical specifications, his face growing paler. "They're planning to test it tomorrow at 9:22 in the morning." Natalie leaned over his shoulder, reading. "These energy readings, they're not stable." "No, they're not." David pulled up the board meeting minutes where the project was approved. "Look at this. My board pushed it through anyway. They ignored all the warning signs because the potential profit margins were too tempting." They spent hours combing through the data, documenting everything they could about Project Kronos. The temporal distortions continued around them. Water fountains ran backward, clocks spun wildly, and once an entire section of floor became transparent, showing the level below as it had looked 30 years ago. As evening approached, David suggested they head to his penthouse. "It's one of the few places that's been relatively stable throughout the loops. We can plan our next move there." The penthouse occupied the top floor of a luxury high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. David ordered dinner while Natalie walked the perimeter, taking in the expensive art and minimalist furniture. "It's beautiful," she said softly. but lonely. David looked around his home with new eyes. Yeah, I guess it is. They sat at the dining table with their takeout, the city lights twinkling below. The conversation flowed naturally, despite their dire circumstances, or perhaps because of them. The need to connect, to understand, felt stronger with each passing loop. I was 9 when my parents left, Natalie said suddenly, pushing her food around her plate. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone one morning. My grandmother took me in, raised me right, but sometimes I still wonder what was so wrong with me that they could just walk away. David reached across the table, touching her hand gently. Nothing was wrong with you. Some people just can't handle being parents. What about your parents? David was quiet for a moment. Lost my mum when I was 10. Cancer. Dad buried himself in work after that. Built the company into what it is now. We barely spoke until he died 5 years ago. He gave a sad smile. Guess we both know something about losing parents young. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted between them. A deeper understanding, a recognition of shared pain and resilience. The moment stretched, warm and genuine. A sharp crack split the air. They both jumped as a massive temporal glitch ripped through the penthouse. The walls crystallized like ice, furniture froze mid-existence, and the very air seemed to solidify around them. They were the only things still moving in a suddenly static world. David! Natalie reached for him as reality began to collapse. The frozen scene shattered like glass, time itself splintering into lethal shards. Their last sensation was of falling through endless fragments of broken moments. Then 7 o'clock arrived again, and David woke with a gasp in his bed, the memory of time's violent collapse still fresh in his mind. David's eyes flew open at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, his heart pounding against his ribs. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone from the nightstand, fingers trembling slightly as he typed out a message to Natalie. Meeting at Mary's. Now. Time running out. He didn't wait for a response. Experience had taught him she would be there, remembering everything just as he did. The drive to Mary's modest house on the outskirts of town felt longer than usual, each traffic light and turn marking another precious minute lost. When he pulled into the gravel driveway, Natalie's beat-up Honda was already there. She stood on the front porch with Mary, both women wrapped in light sweaters against the early morning chill. The sight of them waiting made something twist in David's chest, a feeling of belonging he was still getting used to. Mary welcomed him with a warm hug, as though he were family returning home. "Come in, child," she said, ushering him inside. "We've got work to do." The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls. Mary had laid out 3 mugs and a worn Bible on the wooden table. "Before we face whatever's coming," she said, settling into her chair, "we need to center ourselves." Natalie took her usual seat, and David found himself drawn to the chair beside her. Mary reached for their hands, forming a circle around the table. Her grip was gentle but steady. "Lord," she began, her voice soft but clear, "guide these two through the storms ahead. Shield them with your wisdom and grace." She squeezed David's hand. "And help this young man understand. This trial isn't punishment. It's redirection. Sometimes the hardest paths lead us exactly where we need to be." David felt tears prick at his eyes, unexpected and raw. Mary's words touched something deep inside him. A wound he hadn't known was there. They spent the next hour planning, spreading out maps of the Hale Tech building and reviewing everything they knew about Project Kronos. Mary listened intently, offering insights that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary understanding. "The temporal tears," she mused. "They're worse in places where wrong choices were made, aren't they?" She looked pointedly at David. Maybe healing those moments is part of fixing this. When it was time to leave, Mary insisted on riding with them part way. "Just until the shopping centre," she said. "I've got a feeling you'll need me that far." The morning sun cast long shadows as they drove towards the city. David noticed things he'd never paid attention to before: the way light played through tree branches, how the crossing guard smiled at every child, the elderly couple walking hand in hand. Near the shopping centre, they passed a man struggling with a flat tire. David had driven past this scene in previous loops, but this time something made him pull over. "I'll only be a minute," he told Natalie and Mary, but they both got out to help too. The man, a middle-aged teacher running late for work, was overwhelmed with gratitude. As they worked together to change the tire, David noticed the air around them seemed clearer, more stable. The usual temporal glitches were absent. After dropping Mary off safely at home, they continued toward downtown. At a stoplight, David spotted a homeless veteran he recognized from previous loops, a man who had been caught in one of the worst time fractures. "Wait here," he told Natalie, jumping out. He returned with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of breakfast sandwiches. The veteran's weathered face lit up with surprise and thankfulness. Back in the car, Natalie watched him with soft eyes. "You're different today," she said quietly. "Good different." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Very good different." They pulled into the Hale Tech parking garage at 9:15 in the morning. Security waved them through. Everyone knew David's car. The elevator ride to the lab level was tense with anticipation. "Whatever happens," Natalie said as they approached the final security door, "I'm glad I'm here with you." David swiped his keycard, and they burst into the lab just as technicians were initiating the generator's startup sequence. The massive machine dominated the center of the room, its core already beginning to pulse with an unnatural blue light. Warning lights flashed red across control panels. A technician shouted, "Sir, the containment field is fluctuating." The generator's hum rose to a dangerous whine. Emergency alarms began to blare, their sound distorting as time itself wavered around the unstable core. Through the chaos, David gripped Natalie's hand, both of them knowing this was the moment everything had been leading to. The core's glow intensified, bathing the panicking technicians in its ominous light. As the alarms reached a fever pitch, David and Natalie exchanged a determined look. This was their chance to stop the catastrophe, to break the loop and save not just themselves, but everyone. The chaos in the lab intensified as David rushed to the main control terminal. Screens flickered with warning messages while the generator's core pulsed with an increasingly unstable blue light. He could feel time warping around them. The air itself seemed to bend and twist like a fun-house mirror. "Natalie, the auxiliary power feeds," he shouted over the distorted alarms. "They're in the back corridor. We need to cut them manually." She nodded, already moving. "I'm on it." Her voice echoed strangely, repeating itself in the unstable temporal field. David's fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to access the emergency override protocols. The monitor in front of him kept jumping between screens, showing the same data over and over in an endless loop. He blinked hard, forcing himself to focus through the disorientation. Behind him, 2 technicians phased in and out of existence. There 1 second, gone the next, then back again, their movements jerky like a skipping video. The walls of the lab seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as reality struggled to maintain its shape. "Status report," he called out, his voice distorting. "Almost there." Natalie's reply came from the corridor. "These connections are fighting me. Time keeps rewinding them back together when I pull them apart." David accessed the core containment protocols, but the system rejected his commands. He tried again, sweat beading on his forehead as the generator's whine grew higher, more dangerous. On his 3rd attempt, The screen finally responded. Warning, core containment, critical emergency shutdown required authorization code. His fingers hesitated over the keys. Through the temporal distortions, he could see Natalie in the corridor, her movements determined despite the chaos around her. She was wrestling with thick power cables, trying to disconnect them as time itself worked against her efforts. Her presence here, her unwavering support through all these impossible loops, it had changed something in him, something fundamental. "Natalie," he called out, his voice catching. "I need to tell you something." She looked up, hair falling across her face. "Kind of busy here. I don't want this to end." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "If breaking the loop means losing you, losing this connection we've built, I don't want it." Natalie's hand stilled on the cables. Even through the temporal distortions, he could see the emotion in her eyes. "David, I know it's selfish," he continued, typing in the first part of the shutdown sequence. "But these loops, they brought us together for a reason. You've shown me what really matters, what life should be about." Natalie abandoned the cables for a moment, taking a step toward him despite the unstable reality around them. "I don't want to lose you either," she admitted, her voice soft but clear even through the chaos. "But we can't let fear of losing each other doom everyone else." She was right, of course. David nodded, turning back to the terminal. His fingers moved with renewed purpose, entering the final authorization codes while Natalie returned to the power cables. "Ready?" he called out. "Now." Natalie yanked the final connection free. David hit the execute command. For one terrifying moment, nothing happened. The generator's whine reached an impossible pitch. Time fractured around them. Monitors exploded into cascades of repeating images, ceiling tiles phased through the floor, and the very air seemed to crystallize. Then suddenly, silence. The generator's core dimmed, its dangerous glow fading to nothing. The temporal distortions settled like dust after a storm. Around them, reality smoothed itself out, solidifying into normal, stable time. David stared at the nearest clock, hardly daring to breathe. 9:22 a.m., 9:23 a.m. Time was moving forward. Natalie emerged from the corridor, her eyes wide with disbelief. They stared at each other across the now quiet lab, both realizing what they'd accomplished. A laugh bubbled up from David's chest, half relief, half joy. Natalie's own laughter joined his as they ran to each other, meeting in a tight embrace. "We did it," she whispered against his shoulder. "We actually did it." David held her closer, feeling tears spring to his eyes. Together. We did it together. Around them, the facility hummed with normal activity. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, real and unchanging. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were free of the loop's grip. They spent the next few hours helping to secure the lab, explaining what had happened to bewildered security teams and technicians. As afternoon sun filled the facility with warm light, David felt lighter than he had in months. He turned to share a smile with Natalie, but a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. "Natalie?" He reached out, his vision blurring. "Something's wrong." The world tilted sideways. He felt himself falling, heard Natalie calling his name in alarm. Then darkness took him. When his eyes opened again, he was sitting in booth 3 at Carter's Diner. Sunlight streamed through the familiar windows. The clock on the wall read 7 o'clock in the morning. And there was Natalie, approaching his table with a coffee pot and her usual professional smile. But something was different. Terribly, heartbreakingly different. There was no recognition in her eyes, no trace of their shared experiences or the connection they'd built. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "Coffee?" David stared at the coffee cup as Natalie filled it, her movements precise and professional. The rich aroma that had once brought him comfort now twisted like a knife in his chest. She didn't know him. All those shared moments, quiet conversations, and deep understanding. Gone, erased like footprints in the sand. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the familiar note she'd slipped him. Don't eat it. Leave now. The same warning that had started it all, now a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. Can I get you anything else? Natalie asked with that polite smile. The one meant for strangers, not the warm grin she'd given him after their countless shared adventures through time. No. He managed, his voice rough. Thank you. He left money on the table and walked out, not trusting himself to look back. The morning sun felt too bright, too ordinary for the weight of loss pressing down on his shoulders. His feet carried him through the town streets without direction or purpose. Everything looked exactly the same as it had during the loops, the same storefront displays, the same people going about their morning routines. But now he was alone with the memories, the only one who remembered how many times he'd walked these paths with Natalie by his side. His aimless wandering brought him to a familiar, modest house on the quiet edge of town. Mary's home stood exactly as he remembered it, with its well-tended garden and weathered wind chimes tinkling softly in the breeze. David stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, uncertainty freezing him in place. Would Mary remember? Or would she look at him with the same blank politeness as her granddaughter? Before his hand could reach for the knocker, the door opened. Mary stood there, her gentle eyes filled with something that made David's heart leap. Recognition, but different from before. Shadowed, distant, like viewing a photograph through frosted glass. I've been expecting you, she said softly, though I'm not entirely sure why. David's voice cracked. You remember me? Mary gestured for him to come inside. Not clearly. It's more like an echo, the shape of memories without their substance. Come, sit down. You look like you need tea. He followed her into the familiar kitchen, watching as she moved through the motions of preparing tea with the same careful grace he remembered. The routine was comforting, even as it highlighted everything that had changed. I can't recall the specific events, Mary explained as she set a steaming cup before him. But I remember the feeling of you being here, the impression you left on this house, on our lives. Some memories reset, but connections of the soul, those run deeper than time itself. David wrapped his hands around the warm cup, trying to steady himself. I don't know how to do this, he confessed, words spilling out like water from a broken dam. Start over. Pretend I don't know her. Act like a stranger when I... He couldn't finish the sentence. When you love her, Mary completed gently. He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. Mary reached across the table to pat his hand. This isn't a punishment, David. It's a rebirth, a chance to build something real, something that exists outside the pressure of crisis and time loops. You've been given the opportunity to earn her trust naturally, to let love grow in its own time. But she doesn't even know me anymore, he whispered. She will, Mary assured him. Different circumstances, same souls. The connection that drew you together still exists. It's just waiting to be rediscovered. This time, you can approach it with patience, humility, and pure love, unburdened by the weight of temporal chaos. They sat in companionable silence as David finished his tea, Mary's presence providing a small measure of comfort in his upended world. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door. Remember, she said, sometimes the longest path is the truest one. David stepped out into the late afternoon sun, watching it sink towards the horizon. The day was ending, the first day of his new beginning. Standing there alone, he realized that while the loop had broken, his journey wasn't over. It was just changing shape. He would have to earn Natalie's trust again, one small moment at a time. No shortcuts, no shared crisis to accelerate their connection. Just patient, humble love, offered freely with no guarantee of return. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, reminding him of all the sunsets he and Natalie had watched together during the loops, moments that now existed only in his memory. But maybe Mary was right. Maybe this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A chance to build something real, something that could last beyond the boundaries of repeating time. He would start tomorrow, with a simple cup of coffee and a stranger's smile, and trust that their souls would find their way back to each other. The alarm chimed softly at 7 o'clock in the morning, and David opened his eyes to the familiar ceiling of his penthouse. The usual panic didn't come. Instead, he felt something different stirring in his chest, a quiet determination, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with breaking loops or saving the world. He took his time getting ready, choosing a simple button-down shirt and khakis instead of his usual expensive suit. In the mirror, he practiced his smile until it felt genuine, remembering Mary's words about connections of the soul running deeper than time. The drive to Carter's diner felt different too. He noticed details he'd missed before, the way morning light caught the dewdrops on shop windows, how the crossing guard helped children with gentle patience, the elderly couple walking their small dog along the sidewalk. The world wasn't glitching anymore. It was just living. At exactly 8:14, David stepped into the diner. The bell chimed above his head, and familiar scents of coffee and bacon wrapped around him like a welcome. Natalie approached booth 3 with her usual professional smile, coffee pot in hand. "Good morning," she said, the same words she'd spoken countless times before. But this time, David didn't try to force recognition or explain impossible things. "Good morning," he replied warmly. "How are you today?" The question seemed to surprise her slightly. Most customers didn't ask servers about their day, especially not this early. "I'm doing well, thank you," she answered, pouring his coffee with practiced grace. "Can I get you started with anything besides coffee?" "The breakfast special sounds perfect," he said, even though he'd eaten it hundreds of times before. "And I'd love to hear your recommendation for tomorrow. I'm planning to make this my regular spot." A genuine smile tugged at Natalie's lips. "The French toast is pretty amazing on Wednesdays. My grandmother's recipe." "Your grandmother must be an excellent cook," David said, knowing full well how true that was. "She is," Natalie agreed, her expression softening at the mention of Mary. "She taught me everything I know." Throughout breakfast, David made small talk. Nothing heavy, nothing urgent. He asked about the diner's busy hours, commented on the excellent coffee, and listened attentively when Natalie mentioned the upcoming community fair. When it was time to pay, he left a tip that made her eyes widen. "This is too much," she protested, trying to hand some back. "Not at all," David assured her. "Great service deserves recognition. Have a wonderful day, Natalie." The drive to Mary's house was familiar, but his purpose was different. This wasn't about temporal devices or world-ending catastrophes. This was about being present, being helpful, being human. Mary answered his knock with that same knowing look in her eyes. "David," she said warmly, "come in for some tea." They sat at her kitchen table, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. "I'd like to help," David said simply. "Not with money or influence, just help. What needs doing around here?" Mary studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "Well, since you're asking, the roof's been leaking something awful when it rains. Been meaning to get it fixed, but you know how these things go. I can take care of that." David offered immediately. Today, if you'd like. Mary's eyebrows rose. You know how to fix a roof? David chuckled. I worked construction during college summers, before the tech company, before everything else. It's been a while, but some skills you don't forget. The afternoon found him on Mary's roof, carefully replacing damaged shingles and ceiling leaks. The physical work felt good, honest, straightforward, nothing like the complex temporal mechanics he'd been grappling with. Mary brought him water and watched from below, occasionally calling up suggestions or warnings about his safety. As the sun began its westward slide, David packed up his tools and checked his work one final time. His hands were blistered, his clothes were dirty, and he felt more satisfied than he had in years. Thank you, Mary said as he climbed down. Not just for the roof, for understanding what really needs fixing. David nodded, understanding her deeper meaning. I'm going to stop by the community center before heading home. They might need an extra pair of hands. The community center was a modest building that had seen better days. Inside, volunteers were preparing for an evening program, setting up chairs, organizing craft supplies for children's activities, sorting donated clothes. David rolled up his sleeves and joined in, following directions from the coordinator without mentioning his name or status. For 2 hours he worked alongside retirees and teenagers, listening to their stories and jokes, learning about their lives and challenges. No one treated him like a billionaire because no one knew. He was just another pair of helping hands, and it felt right. Walking back to his car later, David overheard 2 women talking about that nice man who helped with the heavy lifting. It wasn't the way people usually described him, and that made him smile. The evening found him back at Mary's house, saying goodbye under a sky painted with sunset colors. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Will you be back tomorrow? Mary asked. Yes, David replied without hesitation. There's still work to be done. As he drove home, he noticed something profound. The world around him felt solid, stable, real. There were no glitches, no temporal tears, no sense of reality coming undone. Everything was beautifully, perfectly normal. In his penthouse, David changed into comfortable clothes and stood at his window, looking out over the city lights. The loop was still intact. He would wake at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning just like always. But for the first time, that knowledge brought peace instead of dread. He climbed into bed feeling grateful. Grateful for the loop that had brought him here. Grateful for the chance to do things differently. Grateful for the simple joy of being useful. As sleep approached, his last thought was of Natalie's smile when he'd asked about her day. Small, genuine, and full of possibility. The morning sun painted David's penthouse in familiar golden hues as he woke at 7 o'clock. He had lost count of how many loops had passed, but each one felt purposeful now. Getting dressed, he chose casual clothes instead of his usual expensive suit, a simple button-down shirt and comfortable slacks that wouldn't seem out of place at a local diner. The drive to Carter's diner had become a morning meditation. He noticed details he'd missed in earlier loops, the elderly man walking his terrier, children waiting for the school bus, the flower vendor setting up her stand. Each morning held its own quiet beauty. The bell above the diner door chimed at 8:14 as he entered. Natalie looked up from wiping down the counter, offering that warm professional smile he knew so well. "Good morning?" she greeted, reaching for a menu. "Would you like booth 3? David nodded, settling into the familiar spot. "Thank you. And just tea today, if you don't mind." Natalie paused, her pen hovering above her notepad. "Tea? Most folks come in for coffee around this hour. I'm trying to cut back on caffeine," he explained with a gentle smile. "My grandmother always said tea was better for the soul anyway." Mine too, Natalie replied, her eyes brightening. She taught me to add just a touch of honey. Brings out the flavor without overwhelming it. I'd love to try it that way, David said. As Natalie prepared his tea, he noticed her humming softly, a melody he recognized from their previous loops. Is that Amazing Grace? He asked when she returned. Her cheeks flushed slightly. Yes. Sorry, I didn't realize I was humming. It's one of my favorites. Mine too, David said truthfully, having grown to love it through her. The part about I once was lost but now am found always moves me. Natalie's expression softened. That's exactly why I love it. Reminds me there's always hope for change. She glanced around the quiet diner, then added, My grandmother. She taught me all the old hymns while we baked together. Still do every Sunday after church. What do you bake? David asked, though he already knew the answer. Mostly pies, Natalie said, her face lighting up. Grandma Mary has this amazing apple pie recipe that's been in the family for generations, though lately we've been experimenting with peach cobbler too. Over the next several loops, David learned to time his questions perfectly, asking about her nursing school dreams when she mentioned a regular customer's health, inquiring about her favorite books when he spotted her reading during quiet moments. Each conversation built naturally on the last, though for Natalie, each was the first. One morning, after nearly 2 weeks of loops, Natalie brought his tea without him ordering it. She blinked in surprise at her own action. I'm sorry, she said, flustered. I don't know why I just assumed. Have you been here before? You feel so familiar. David's heart squeezed. I've been coming in for a little while now, he said carefully. Maybe that's why. No, it's more than that, Natalie said slowly, studying his face. Like déjà vu, but stronger. When you smiled just now, I could have sworn. Could have sworn what? He asked softly. That I knew exactly how you'd smile, she finished, shaking her head. I must sound crazy. Not at all, David assured her. Sometimes people just connect, like they were meant to know each other. Have we met before? Natalie asked directly, her dark eyes searching his. I can't shake this feeling. David fought back the tears, threatening to well up. I hope we're getting there, he managed to say. That evening, as David helped Mary repair her wooden fence, he heard a car pull up. His heart skipped when he recognized Natalie's old blue sedan. Grandma, Natalie called out, carrying 2 paper bags of groceries. I brought those things you asked for. Oh. She stopped short at the sight of David, hammer in hand. David's been helping around the house, Mary explained, coming down the porch steps. Been a real blessing, fixing things I couldn't manage on my own. That's really kind of you, Natalie said, looking at David with that same puzzled recognition in her eyes. Least I could do, David replied, carefully setting down his tools. Your grandmother's been very welcoming. As they carried the groceries inside together, David noticed Natalie watching him from the corner of her eye. The way she moved around him was different now, less like a stranger, more like someone trying to remember a dream. Mary busied herself putting away the groceries, leaving them in a moment of charged silence by the screen door. The evening light caught Natalie's face. Just so, reminding David of countless sunset conversations they'd shared in other loops. Would you like to stay for dinner? Mary called out suddenly. Made plenty of chicken and dumplings? Oh, I wouldn't want to impose, David started to say, but Natalie spoke at the same time. He should stay, Grandma. She looked as surprised by her words as David felt. A soft blush colored her cheeks. I mean, if you'd like to. That inexplicable warmth in her voice, the one he'd heard in so many loops before, made his heart soar. She might not remember their shared past, but her soul recognized his. For now, that was enough. The familiar chime of 7 o'clock pierced through David's consciousness as he opened his eyes to the start of another loop. Sunlight streamed through his penthouse windows, but something felt different today. Lighter, more hopeful. He took his time getting dressed, choosing a casual blue button-down instead of his usual suit. The morning held promise, like the first day of spring after a long winter. When he walked into Carter's diner at 8:14, Natalie looked up from behind the counter. Her smile was different. Warmer, with a hint of recognition that hadn't been there in previous first meetings of the loop. "Good morning," she said, already reaching for a menu, though he hadn't even sat down. "Booth 3. David's heart skipped. She'd never predicted his seating preference before, not on a first interaction. "Yes, please," he managed to say. As she led him to the booth, her movements were more relaxed, almost familiar. She set down his menu and paused, tilting her head slightly. "Tea today, right? Not coffee?" "How did you know?" David asked carefully. Natalie blinked, seeming surprised by her own certainty. "I'm not sure. Just had a feeling, I guess. Earl Grey." "That would be perfect," he said softly, watching her face for any sign of deeper recognition. She returned with his tea moments later, steam curling from the delicate cup. "You know," she said, lingering by the table, "this is going to sound strange, but I had a dream about serving tea last night, to someone just like you." David's fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. "Maybe it's a sign," he offered gently. "Maybe," she agreed, her dark eyes studying his face with quiet curiosity before she moved on to other customers. After breakfast, David drove to the community center on Oak Street. The brick building had become familiar to him over countless loops, its worn steps and faded murals now as known to him as his own reflection. Inside he found Mrs. Peterson, the elderly program coordinator, struggling with a broken wheelchair. "The wheel keeps sticking," she explained, demonstrating how it caught every few turns. "We can't afford a new one, and poor Mr. Garcia needs it for his art class." "Let me take a look," David offered, rolling up his sleeves. He spent the next 2 hours carefully dismantling and cleaning the wheelchair's mechanism, replacing a worn bearing with one he'd brought from his company's machine shop. The simple work felt good, immediate, tangible, meaningful in a way his corporate decisions never had. "You're a blessing," Mrs. Peterson said when the wheelchair rolled smoothly again. "Mr. Garcia will be so relieved." As if on cue, the elderly artist rolled into the room, his weathered face lighting up at the sight of his repaired chair. "Gracias, señor," he said warmly, reaching for David's hand. "Now I can finish teaching the children's painting class." David helped transfer Mr. Garcia to his newly repaired wheelchair, touched by the man's grateful smile. These were the moments that mattered, the small kindnesses that rippled outward, touching life after life. By early afternoon, he was pulling into Mary's driveway. She stood on her porch as if expecting him, which didn't surprise him anymore. Mary had always seemed to operate on a different wavelength than everyone else, picking up echoes of the loops even when she couldn't quite remember them. "Perfect timing," she called out. "The kitchen sink's been acting up." David spent the next few hours beneath Mary's sink, fixing a stubborn leak while she baked something that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. They talked easily as he worked, about faith, about second chances, about the way life sometimes circled back to give you another try at getting things right, you know. Mary said thoughtfully, setting a glass of lemonade near his toolbox. "Natalie mentioned you this morning. Said she felt like she knew you from somewhere." David carefully tightened the final pipe fitting. What did you tell her? That sometimes the heart remembers what the mind forgets. Mary replied with a knowing smile. And that God has his own timeline for bringing people together. As evening approached, David made his way back to Carter's diner. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, Natalie was finishing up her shift, wiping down tables with practiced efficiency. She looked up when he entered, and that same soft recognition flickered in her eyes. Back again? If that's okay, he said, sliding into a booth. Thought I'd try the meatloaf special. Good choice. She smiled, bringing him water without being asked. As she took his order, her movements were unhurried, comfortable. She kept glancing at him throughout his meal, as if trying to place a half-remembered face in a crowd. When closing time came, David waited as she completed her closing duties. She emerged from the diner to find him standing by his car. Would you mind... She started, then hesitated. Would you mind walking with me to my car, just for a minute? They walked together through the quiet lot, their footsteps echoing in the evening stillness. The air was warm, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from the nearby garden. Can I tell you something strange? Natalie asked, stopping beneath a lamppost. Sometimes I get this feeling like I'm living the same day over and over, like everything I'm doing I've done before. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking vulnerable. Does that sound crazy? David's heart ached to tell her everything. Instead, he said gently, I don't think it sounds crazy at all. Sometimes I think life gives us second chances, opportunities to do things differently, to become who we're meant to be. Yes, she breathed, looking relieved. That's exactly it. Like every day is a chance to get it right. She studied his face in the soft lamplight. I feel like I know you, really know you, but that's impossible, isn't it? Maybe some connections are just meant to be, he offered quietly. Maybe some people are supposed to find each other, no matter what. Natalie nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. She seemed on the verge of saying more, her lips parting slightly as if the words were right there, waiting to be spoken. But after a moment, she just smiled. A smile full of questions and possibilities. Good night, David, she whispered, her voice carrying a warmth that made his heart swell. He watched her walk to her car, the soft glow of the lamplight creating a halo around her. As she drove away, he remained standing there, feeling the weight of all their shared memories, memories she couldn't access, but somehow still felt. The ache in his chest was different now. It wasn't the sharp pain of loss anymore, but the gentle throb of hope. The morning sun streamed through David's penthouse windows at precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, and he opened his eyes to face another loop. But something felt different today. The air seemed lighter, cleaner somehow, as if the weight of repeated time had begun to lift. He took extra care getting ready, choosing a simple blue button-down shirt instead of his usual power suit. In his heart, he knew appearance didn't matter. Natalie had seen him at his worst and his best through countless loops. Still, this morning carried a whisper of possibility that made him want to honor it. The drive to Carter's diner felt both familiar and new. The same delivery trucks made their rounds, the same joggers passed on their morning routes, but David noticed details he'd missed before. The way the maple trees along Main Street had just started turning golden, how the morning light caught the dew on storefront windows. At exactly 8:14 in the morning, he pulled into his usual parking spot at the diner. Through the window, he could see Natalie moving between tables with her characteristic grace. His heart quickened as he pushed open the door, hearing the familiar bell chime above. Natalie looked up at the sound, and something flickered in her eyes. recognition deeper than mere familiarity with a regular customer. She approached his booth with a coffee pot in hand, but her usual steady movements seemed slightly uncertain. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of wonder. As she poured his coffee, David noticed her hand trembling slightly. The morning light caught the steam rising from his cup, creating a delicate dance in the air between them. "Good morning, Natalie," he replied, watching as she set his plate down with careful precision. With movements that seemed both hesitant and determined, she slipped a folded piece of paper beside his plate. David's heart caught in his throat. He knew this moment, had lived it countless times before. But as he unfolded the note, his eyes widened in surprise. There, in Natalie's neat handwriting, were 3 simple words: "You can stay." He looked up to find her still standing there, a deep blush coloring her cheeks. Her hands were clasped together, betraying her nervousness. I don't know why I wrote that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just felt like I had to, like something inside me knew it was important." She paused, searching his face. "Is that strange?" David felt tears welling in his eyes as he looked at the note, then back at her. All those loops, all those repeated days had been leading to this moment. "No," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not strange at all, and I would like nothing more than to stay." Natalie's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she'd been holding her breath. She glanced around the nearly empty diner, then back at him. "I get off at 4 o'clock, she said. Would you like to have dinner with me and my grandmother?" "I'd love that," David replied, carefully folding the note and tucking it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Throughout her shift, Natalie kept finding reasons to pass by his booth. She'd refill his water even when the glass was nearly full, straighten napkins that didn't need straightening, ask if he needed anything else with a shy smile that made his heart soar. Each time she passed, it felt like another piece of their connection was slowly rebuilding itself. The afternoon passed in a gentle haze of anticipation. When 4 o'clock arrived, David waited outside while Natalie changed out of her uniform. They drove separately to Mary's house, following the familiar route that had become sacred to him through countless loops. Mary stood on her porch as they pulled up, wearing that knowing smile that suggested she understood far more than she let on. "Well, isn't this a blessed surprise?" she said, though her tone suggested it wasn't a surprise at all. The evening unfolded with a natural ease that felt like coming home. Mary had prepared her famous pot roast, filling the house with rich, comforting aromas. They gathered around her well-worn dining table, saying grace together as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the lace curtains. Throughout dinner, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Natalie shared stories about her childhood, about learning to cook at Mary's, about her dreams of becoming a nurse. David listened intently, treasuring each detail, even the ones he'd heard before in other loops. They felt new again, watching her eyes light up as she spoke. As Mary served her homemade apple pie for dessert, Natalie's hand came to rest on the table near David's, not quite touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about her growing trust in him. "You know," Mary said, looking between them with gentle wisdom in her eyes, "sometimes God brings people together in His own time. We just have to be patient enough to wait for His perfect timing." David felt Natalie's pinky finger brush against his, so softly it might have been accidental. But when he glanced at her, the slight pink in her cheeks told him it wasn't. After helping with the dishes, despite Mary's protests, David stepped out onto the back porch to catch his breath. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of Mary's rose garden. He looked up at the sky, marveling at its stillness. No more flickering, no more temporal tears ripping through the fabric of reality. Just countless stars shining steadily in the velvet darkness, time flowing forward as it was meant to. David opened his eyes at 7 o'clock in the morning, and immediately he knew something was different. The weight of desperation that had pressed against his chest through countless loops was gone, replaced by a lightness he hadn't felt in what seemed like lifetimes. The sunrise streaming through his penthouse windows looked fresher, more vibrant, like the world itself had been renewed. He dressed with care, humming softly as he chose a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis instead of his usual expensive suit. The drive to Carter's diner felt peaceful, each moment precious not because it might reset, but because it was genuinely new. When he walked through the door at 8:14, Natalie was already looking his way. Her face lit up with a smile that reached deep into her eyes, warming them like sunshine on still water. She hurried over, coffee pot in hand. "I had the strangest feeling you'd be here today," she said, pouring his cup with familiar grace. "And I'm so glad you are. I woke up this morning feeling like everything is about to change, in the most wonderful way." David smiled up at her, his heart full. "I know exactly what you mean." After breakfast, David gathered his courage and asked if she'd like to walk with him to Mary's house. To his joy, Natalie agreed immediately, untying her apron and calling to the kitchen that she was taking her break. The morning air was sweet as they walked side by side, their steps falling naturally in rhythm. Natalie told him about her dreams from the night before, visions of golden light and endless possibilities. David listened, treasuring every word. Mary was in her kitchen when they arrived, kneading bread dough, with practiced hands. Her knowing smile made David wonder, not for the first time, just how much she understood about time's strange dance. "Well now," she said, dusting flour from her hands. "This feels right as rain. Why don't you two help me with these loaves? There's plenty of dough to go around." The afternoon unfolded like a gift. David learned the proper way to knead bread, laughing as flour dusted his nose. Natalie taught him her grandmother's secret recipe for cinnamon rolls, her hands guiding his as they spread the filling. Mary shared stories of Natalie's childhood, making them all laugh until tears streamed down their faces. Between stories and baking, they shared quiet dreams. Natalie spoke of finishing her nursing degree. David admitted he wanted to start a charitable foundation focused on community health care. Their hopes wove together naturally, like they'd always been meant to align. As evening approached, they moved to Mary's front porch. The sky was painting itself in shades of gold and rose, the sunset more beautiful than any David could remember. He and Natalie sat on the porch swing, gentle creaks marking their slow back and forth motion. Natalie's head came to rest on his shoulder, fitting there as if it had always belonged. "You know what's strange?" she murmured. "I feel like I've known you forever, like my soul recognized yours the moment you walked into the diner. Is that crazy?" David wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "Not crazy at all," he said softly. "Natalie, I promise you this. However life unfolds from here, whatever paths time takes us down, I will always choose you. In every version of reality, in every moment we're given." She snuggled closer, sighing contentedly. They watched the stars emerge one by one, the night settling around them like a comfortable blanket. For the first time in countless loops, David didn't feel the anxious pull of impending reset. Time flowed forward, steady and true. When midnight chimed from Mary's old grandfather clock, David held his breath, but nothing changed. No glitches, no temporal tears, no washing away of memories. just the peaceful tick of seconds moving forward as they should. He drove home under a canopy of stars, heart full of gratitude. And when he woke the next morning, it was to a sunrise he had never seen before, gloriously, wonderfully new. David smiled, tears of joy pricking his eyes. He had been given not just a second chance at time, but a second chance at everything that made life worth living: love, faith, purpose, and the precious gift of moving forward, one unrepeated moment at a time. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.